Well, you might remember a few months ago how in her bid to become the next Scottish First Minister, Kate Forbes came under fire for her Christian views. She was running for that position as First Minister of Scotland. She was being interviewed an awful lot, and it was discovered that she was in fact an evangelical Christian, and as you might expect, she was grilled ruthlessly for that fact. And so her views on issues such as same-sex relationships, transgenderism, having children before marriage, she was interrogated on all of these things. And while I think her ability to hold her own was respected by many people in the media, at the same time, of course, we can't avoid the fact that this is yet one more proof that basic Christian teachings are being viewed by many people today as socially unacceptable. Certainly unacceptable for someone holding a political position. Kate Forbes was seen as an extremist, as a pariah. And we can't help but ask ourselves then, what are the implications of this for us? In all likelihood, we live in a world where our views are going to seem stranger and stranger to most of the people we surround ourselves with, more and more unacceptable, more and more we will find ourselves on the receiving end of loaded questions, cunning objections, attempts to impugn our own characters. Maybe you're very conscious of that threat already in your daily life. So, how do we respond to those kinds of objections? How do we respond to the pointed questions, the criticisms? Well, I think this passage that we read a moment ago, Mark chapter 10, verses 1 to 12, actually goes some way in helping us in this respect. You see, in this passage, it's Jesus who finds himself on the receiving end of a hostile interview. He's the one who's being probed about his stance on a contentious moral issue. And so surely then we have the right to study this passage and to see how Jesus himself responds to this kind of interrogation, and then to ask ourselves, is there anything that we can learn from his response? And that's just the approach I'm taking this evening. I'm asking that simple question, how can we imitate our Saviour? How can we imitate Jesus when the world takes us to task? And I have three answers to that question based on this passage. And my first answer is this: be aware. Be aware. See, the Pharisees, they want to test Jesus, don't they? And we can't help but read this. We can't help when we read this but ask the question, well, how do these Pharisees imagine the next few moments to unfold? Well, probably they imagine something like this. The Pharisees come along to Jesus and they ask, as they do ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And what they think they're doing there is they're restricting Jesus really to a yes or a no answer. Now, Jesus could answer the question, yes, divorce is lawful. But if he did that, he would be contradicting something he said previously in his ministry. Back in the book of Matthew, on the Sermon of the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 31, Jesus had preached very clearly against divorce on that occasion. And so presumably then, the Pharisees are expecting Jesus on this occasion as well to back up what he said at the Sermon on the Mount and say, no, divorce is not lawful. He's going to answer the question in the negative. Indeed, the Pharisees aren't just expecting Jesus to take that position. They are positively hoping Jesus will take that position. They want Jesus to say that he opposes divorce for the simple reason that they have a pre-planned put-down. When Jesus says, no, divorce is not lawful, what the Pharisees will do, I think, is they will play the Moses card. They will whip out Deuteronomy chapter 24. Haven't you read Deuteronomy chapter 24, Jesus? In that chapter, it talks about the case of a man who gives his wife a certificate of divorce and puts it into her hand and sends her out of his house. It's clear, isn't it? And yes, Jesus might be able to conjure up a few responses to that, but at least by that point we will have drawn him out into the long grass. We will have made him hot under the collar. At least at that point, we'll have undermined something of his authority in the presence of all these crowds. Jesus is muddled about the law of Moses. Jesus doesn't know the law of Moses as well as the Pharisees do. Jesus has never read Deuteronomy chapter 24. Even better, Jesus is not on side with Moses. We are. Jesus is drawing people away from Moses. That, I think, is probably how the Pharisees hope the next few moments will unfold. But that's not how the next few moments unfold at all, is it? Because the way Jesus answers their question tells us that Jesus knows full well what these Pharisees are up to. He was well aware of what they were doing. And that's evident in the fact that these Pharisees are not the first people to mention Moses in this passage. No, what happens? The Pharisees ask the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Jesus says, what did Moses command you? Jesus mentions Moses first. Jesus plays the Moses card first. Jesus goes directly to the point, the place where they were wanting him to wriggle away from, the law of Moses. And by doing that then, he makes it clear right from the beginning that he is totally unashamed of Moses and his law. What did Moses command you, he asks. He's aware of what's going on, so he beats them to it. And actually, I think it's an ingenious question which Jesus now asks of these Pharisees. It's ingenious because whatever you might argue from the law of Moses, Moses certainly did not command the right to divorce. And the Pharisees knew it. Because, as the Pharisees respond, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce, they say. And by saying that then, they really help make Jesus' point for him. Divorce is not a commandment in the law, it's an allowance, it's a permission. In other words, divorce was part of a fallen society that the law of God graciously accommodated to and adapted for and made allowances for. As Jesus says, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. On my way up to the seminary where I study, I walk from my house in Long Benton in Newcastle, and I'm walking into the city centre. And on my way, I walk up this long bank. It's called Matthew Bank. And running up alongside that bank on my left-hand side, between me and Jesmond Dean, is a long line of metal railings. And you look at those railings then, and you see how cleverly that the plants have learnt to best work their way around those railings. Ivy and holly and beech branches all cleverly weaving their way through, accommodating to those stiff metal bars. Without compromising their own integrity as plants, nevertheless, they have adapted to their unnatural circumstances. It's quite intelligent. Well, the law of Moses, the civil law of Israel, was a bit like that. It weaved its way around an ancient Israelite context, a fallen Israelite context. Yes, every one of its principles were absolutely divine, absolutely perfect. But nevertheless, it also had to be realistic. It couldn't simply push through those metal bars. Instead, it chose to work around them, work around the obstacle of the human heart, making accommodations and allowances where necessary. And in this case, then, Jesus is pointing out that in Deuteronomy chapter 24, it made an allowance for the reality of divorce. You see, I think Jesus' point is that Israelite society, in its fallen state, was not able to cope with a strict divorce law. These were a stiff-necked, hard-hearted society, and that was a problem which the law alone could not fix. And so, in this case, in this unique scenario, it made allowances for. And Jesus' words here are quite strong, aren't they? He says, because of your hardness of heart. He says that to the Pharisees. In other words, he's identifying the Pharisees he's speaking to now with the hard-hearted society in the day of Moses. They, he is saying, the Pharisees he is speaking to, were not the strong defenders of the law of Moses that they like to think they were. No, he is saying, you Pharisees, you are like those stiff-necked railings that the law of Moses had to awkwardly accommodate to. If anything, those Pharisees were the impediment to the law. They were the very ones whose resistance to the law of God had been so stubborn, so prolonged, so rigid, that in the end, the law had to bend around them. See, these Pharisees, they want to portray this whole thing as Jesus on the one side, and then Moses and the Pharisees and the law on the other. Jesus doesn't let them do that. No, as far as he's concerned, it's the Pharisees on the one side and the law, Moses and Jesus on the other. And all of that really is simply to say that Jesus just doesn't fall for their trap. Right from the beginning, he is aware of the trap he's being set. He has seen through their devices, and he is refusing to be drawn into the direction they're taking him. He is aware. That's my first point. That's an important principle then, I think, in our own interaction with those who seek to trap us, with those in the world around us. Now, obviously, my application this evening can't be as ingenious as Jesus, because that is just not a realistic thing to demand of you. I can't say always have the right answers to the questions that you're asked. But nevertheless, I think there is a general principle, perhaps you think it's too general, but I think it's a principle nevertheless that the Bible insists upon, and it's this: enter your interactions with people with awareness. We find it in the writing of Peter, don't we? What does Peter say? Peter says, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. In other words, what Peter is saying is, do not just engage in these contentions casually. Be thoughtful about it. Perhaps long in advance. Be lucid about it. Do it carefully, with full awareness and preparations made. And surely then Peter is encouraging these Christians to do this because Peter has seen Jesus making those kind of preparations himself. Jesus was aware. Jesus was a man who could interact with people not flippantly, he wouldn't run headlong into debates. No, he took his time and he was aware of what was happening. Probably Jesus' own mind was furnished with those great proverbs. Proverbs like Proverbs 15:28. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Or Proverbs 17:27. Whoever restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. So Jesus here, he keeps his cool. He limits his words. He chooses them carefully and thoughtfully. He remains lucid and aware. And so I'm saying to you then this evening, be aware. Be aware of who you're speaking to. Be aware of where you're being led in your conversations. Be aware of the words which are coming out of your own mouth. When you're confronted about your faith, be aware. It's just plain embarrassing, isn't it, to see Christians at times arguing away with a kind of, as if it's a sort of mindless activity, doing it almost as casually as mowing the lawn or whistling a tune. And you watch on then and you see them mindlessly arguing themselves into all sorts of traps and ending up looking very foolish. I suppose we've all been there at points in our life to argue and argue and argue, only to realize we've argued ourselves into a corner and even we're not convinced about what we're saying anymore. And I'm saying, for the sake of the gospel, don't be like that. That's not a good place to be. It's not a responsible attitude to have. No, take it seriously when the world takes you to task. Slow down, Take it carefully, cautiously, be prepared, and be aware. That's my first point this evening. My second principle from this passage is this: think big. Think big. By the way, I should say at this point that if it's helpful, my points are not so much 1, 2, 3, but A, B, and C. Be aware, think big, and you'll find out what C is in a moment. So, think big, that's my second point. Now, as you'll be fully aware, by Jesus' day, there was an awful lot of extra teachings that had been written up alongside the law of Moses. And in some ways, that was only logical, wasn't it? You know, a passage like Deuteronomy chapter 24, it raised questions which scribes had to discuss back and forth for generations. And on this issue of divorce then, some people had argued from all sorts of different positions on this. Some people had a very narrow view of what was acceptable. Other people took a more liberal position. Many people in Jesus' day argued for what was effectively a no-divorce law. A no-fault divorce law. A law in which people can freely move in and out of their marriages. And Jesus himself could have been drawn into those kinds of debates, and probably that's what these Pharisees are hoping for. But what I want you to see now is that from verse 6, Jesus makes a radical departure from this whole question of the law of Moses. See, right now, you see, Jesus is speaking in the presence of these crowds, and to find himself arguing over legal technicalities would not be a helpful approach, at least for their sakes. And for that reason, then, I think Jesus now steers the conversation somewhere else. It's not that he's being evasive, it's not that he's sidestepping the question, but it's almost as if he's addressing the Pharisees' question at a deeper level. He opens up a bigger picture with regards to marriage and divorce. See, instead of talking about Moses, in verse 6, Jesus now talks about the beginning of the creation. That is to say, Jesus doesn't want to discuss technicalities of a law that made accommodations for hard-hearted, sinful people. No, he wants to talk about the law in its original state, its primitive, pristine state. He takes us back to God's law as it was meant to be in the beginning, in perfect, sinless Eden, where it had no impediment, no obstacle in the human heart, and where God's design had free sway. To return back to my illustration, as you walk up Matthew Bank and peer at those railings and the tangle of vines around the railings, you can't help but let your eye be drawn back to behind the railings. You look back at those branches at their point of origin, and what do you see there? Well, you see behind the railings this thriving garden of vegetation, big, thick trunks of trees, beeches and ashes and conifers and hollies, and they're unimpeded there. They're free, they're luscious. Well, here in this passage, it's almost as if Jesus is looking behind those railings of the law and into the law in its perfect state, into the trees. He's looking really into the Garden of Eden, where the law of God was able to thrive naturally and the principles of human purpose and prosperity were first established. And there then, within that perfect garden, he sees the original design for marriage. And he directs our minds towards that, away from the mere allowance of divorce that the Pharisees were interested in. He shifts our focus off the railings and upon the trees behind the railings. And so what does he teach us then about God's original design for marriage? What do we see when we peer back into Eden? Well, actually, to the shame of the Pharisees, everything Jesus now says in verses 6 to 8 is simply quoting from Genesis 2, written by Moses himself. It's not as if Jesus is doing anything original here, but nevertheless, through those quotations alone, he takes our mind into higher, better, fresher, planes. He takes our mind to God's purposes for marriage from the beginning. And he shows us then that when we look at the big picture, we see that marriage was never just about bits of paper or legal contracts. It was never just about certificates being passed back and forth. It was never about the changing romantic appetites of the human heart. No, it was something more profound than that. At the heart of every marriage was supposed to be this inseparable melding of two people into one flesh. Verse 7, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. This is the deep mingling of human beings, this determined faithfulness, this holding fast to one another against all the odds to the very end, only dissolved by death itself. That's what marriage was supposed to be. It was supposed to be that inseparable bond between human beings, between male and female, between the two sexes. That was the good, wonderful purpose that God had it to be. It wasn't just law, it wasn't just romantic desire, it was something deeper and more fundamental and more mysterious and more wonderful than any of that. And perhaps you hear that and you say, well, that's rather idealistic. But yes, it's God's ideal for mankind. And while hard-hearted people might resist that ideal at all costs, for the follower of Jesus Christ, that is something which is lovely and good. It's something that we wish to embrace. And Jesus is saying then, for my followers, marriage is a serious thing because it's a profoundly beautiful and good thing. And to think lightly of marriage has terrible consequences, doesn't it? Verse 12, or verse 11, and he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Jesus is telling his disciples that a society where divorce is a small matter is a society of adultery. A society of adulterers. A society which has become so obsessed with reading into Deuteronomy chapter 24, reading into the mere allowances, that it hasn't even noticed it's completely abandoned the seventh commandment. Do not commit adultery. A society where a man commits adultery against his wife and a wife against her husband. That's an unstable, chaotic society set against itself. A society where a man no longer leaves father and mother and holds fast to his wife, as Jesus says, but rather we might say he leaves multiple fathers or multiple mothers and only holds lightly to a series of wives. And that is not a good place for a society to be. And that's what Jesus is saying. My people do not want that. No, we want to spend our lives not living in the crevice of an allowance within the law or a permission within the law. No, we want something better than that. We want the law as it was supposed to be from the beginning. We want God's principles in Eden. We want the original design. We're committed to that. And yes, we understand, of course, that the world is messy and complicated, and you can debate the meaning of Deuteronomy 24 for as long as you'd like, but the bottom line is that we love the law of God, and we believe that's best, and that then is the big picture which Jesus now takes them to. So what's the principle for us then in all of this? Well, I think the principle is this, that when we are confronted about our stance on this issue or that issue, we need to think big. That is, we need to go to the big picture. And actually, I think this is something which Jesus does very frequently when he's asked these kinds of questions by people. Think about Jesus being tested on the Sabbath. You know, will he heal this man with the withered hand on the Sabbath? Why do his disciples pluck grain on the Sabbath? And Jesus responds to those situations by referring to the big picture. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good, he asks. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, he says. You see, instead of getting lost in detailed legislation about what precisely is right or wrong to do on the Sabbath, no, he draws us back to the original purpose of the Sabbath as a whole, the big picture, and he tells us about its design. Or think about when Jesus is asked by the Pharisees for a sign. They want to see a miracle from him. But instead of acting on their terms, he responds by questioning the very need for a sign. He says, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign. So again, he's sort of opening up the bigger picture. He's not just responding on their terms, he's asking something bigger than that. He's asking, well, what kind of person are you in the first place to make that a requirement of me, to need a sign before you can believe in me? And I'm saying that's typical of Jesus. Most of his responses to questions, I think, can be reduced often to these big statements which go to the heart of the matter and don't get lost in the technicalities. And again, I'm not suggesting that you speak with the same depth and ingenuity that Jesus does, but what I can suggest is that we keep our picture big when we're asked these kinds of difficult questions. I mean, think about it. We are Christians, after all. That means our whole view of life is fundamentally different to other people. That means we have big visions about what this world is heading towards and what's happened in history and where we've come from. We have a worldview which is huge compared to many of those around us. And that means then that when we're taken to task on what we think about this issue or that issue, we mustn't feel constrained to act on the terms which are being set to us. No, we can think big. Let me just give you a modern example. And it's not a perfect example, but it's one that I've had in my head for a while, and perhaps it's helpful. Imagine you're asked a question about same-sex marriage. Imagine you're asked, do you think gay people should have the right to get married? Now, you could answer that question on the terms which are set to you, and you could say no, and leave it at that. And maybe that's the approach you would adopt. I'm not necessarily criticizing that. But the problem there is because you're answering that question on the terms which have been set to you, you're probably going to be misunderstood. You're probably going to be heard as saying something like, well, gay people don't deserve to be married. They don't have the rights to be married. As if your objection to gay marriage is based on some prejudice against gay people. And for that reason, I think it's better to ask a bigger question at that point, to open up the bigger picture, to ask questions like, what is marriage? What makes marriage distinct from other relationships? And then to go on to explain that you believe that marriage, as Jesus is saying, is the union of the sexes, the foundation of the family, that it's this profoundly wonderful and unique relationship between men and women. And for that reason, then, that's why you oppose same-sex marriage. It's not because you think that gay people don't deserve to be married or something like that. Actually, it's got very little to do with gay people at all. Rather, the bare fact of the matter is that two people of the same sex cannot be united in the same way that a man and a woman can. Same-sex marriage is a contradiction in terms. It's a meaningless concept. You raise those sorts of issues. Now, maybe you think that's too complicated an approach. Maybe you think it's easier just to simply say, no, they shouldn't marry. Fair enough if that's how you would answer that question. But even still, I think you can help people to sort of see the big picture insofar as you can help them to see why you think what you think. To say to people, look, really, at the bottom level here, I just believe that God's design for human relationships is good, even if that involves serious sacrifices for certain people. That maybe sounds like a very basic thing to say, but I think actually for many people, they just don't think of it in those ways, and actually opening the big picture like that could be very helpful. It might just take a remark like that to reorient the whole conversation and to bring it back to the basics, which is where you want to meet people at. So that's my second principle then. Think big. Don't be hemmed in by the questions you're asked. Think big in your responses. So first, be aware. Second, think big. And then thirdly, speak courageously. That's my A, B, and C. Be aware, think big, speak courageously. Of course, it's not fashionable in this society to have socially conservative views on marriage and sexuality in the 21st century. But this passage reminds us, doesn't it, that actually on certain issues, Jesus' followers have always been accused of being illiberal and narrow-minded, even by Pharisees, people we might think are very illiberal and very narrow. You see, their reason for asking Jesus this question seems to be because they want him to walk over certain tripwires. And at the end of the day, they have good reason for wanting Jesus to walk over those tripwires, because they saw him as a political threat. They want to scupper his chances of advancing any further. And so they want him then to say things that would make him look like an extremist. They want to dirty his name and dirty his reputation in the public square. They want people in those crowds who so far had seen Jesus as an attractive, countercultural icon to be now thrown off and to be upset to see that actually Jesus' real views are hardline and conservative. They want people to be exposed to the unattractive side of Jesus' views. And they hope then that would be too much for those people. Maybe people like the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, or the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8, or all of those other sinners that Jesus had previously spent time with. Surely the Pharisees think to themselves, those sorts of people would no longer feel Jesus' love for them now that they could see his real conservative beliefs. No, instead they would feel judged by Jesus, rejected by Jesus. They would feel like an ugly sinner in his eyes. And they would back off from these hard teachings and reject the man they were following. Perhaps that's what the Pharisees want to happen. Perhaps they wanted worse things to happen. I mean, they knew full well, didn't they, that not very long ago, John the Baptist had been executed. For what reason? Well, essentially for speaking out on sexual ethics. He had accused Herod of adultery, of taking his brother's wife, and that accusation had seen the end of John. And it's not too far-fetched then that these Pharisees also want to draw Jesus into these dangerous, controversial waters. They want to stir up Herod's anxieties. And hopefully that will see the end of Jesus. And I suppose then my point here is that there is a real sense in which Jesus' options are limited. At a purely human level, he cannot give the perfect answer. He cannot leave everyone satisfied. The nature of the situation is that some people will be offended, some people will misunderstand, some people will be left angry, and they will think then that Jesus' teaching against divorce is a sign of an unattractive Messiah, and they will leave him. And it's at this point then that we have to say that Jesus' commitment to truth, to stating his beliefs honestly, trumps all of those other considerations. Keeping the peace is important to Jesus, yes. Avoiding misunderstanding is important to Jesus, yes. Revealing to people hard matters at a careful pace, gently, is important to Jesus, yes. But none of those considerations can be allowed to compromise Jesus' commitment to truth. And that is why then that when it comes to it, Jesus says what is right, even if it comes at a price. He says that divorce is wrong. In fact, he says something quite stronger than that, doesn't he? I mean, for one thing, he says to these disciples privately that, as we said, those who promote a culture of divorce are promoting a culture of adultery. But arguably, what he's actually said publicly is even stronger than that. He said, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." He accuses these people of being against God's design, of tearing apart God's design. In fact, you could even say that he accuses them of a murder of sorts, because if a husband and wife are naturally one flesh, one fused, intermingled, undividable unit that cannot be prized apart naturally, then breaking that bond is possible only through an act of great violence. To divide one flesh, to divide marriage, is to rip apart one living organism. And for that reason, then, virtually every divorce involves a sin for which someone is culpable. They are hard words, I know full well, on modern ears. But they are hard words on ancient ears as well. And the situation Jesus is caught in here demands that he speaks those words truthfully. And so he says them. And my simple point then is that this demands courage on Jesus' part. Because he knows full well that the moment he opens his mouth, the facial expressions of those around him are going to change. Disappointment, unbelief, fury. Large portions of those crowds perhaps may well disappear. Perhaps Herod will soon be finding out about this. He knows that those Pharisees may even have a smirk appearing on their lips as they see Jesus making this hard statement about adultery, and they realize that his ministry has taken a blow. They have, in part, succeeded. Jesus beautifully weaves his way around the tests of the Pharisees, but even then, his ministry doesn't remain undamaged. There is a cost involved. Answering these questions honestly is a hard thing that demands courage. And of course, very little has changed for us today, hasn't it? You know, in the case of someone like Kate Forbes, the costs are particularly high, aren't they? Because she knows full well that whatever she says in interviews to the media will define her career forever. She knows that even the most couched, the most carefully qualified statement is soon going to be reduced to a single headline or the title of a YouTube video. She knows that to speak the truth under those conditions requires enormous courage. But the same is true, of course, of people like you and I. In the workplace, in the school playground, to our friends and our neighbours, on the internet, there is always a cost involved. And in certain situations, you are going to feel that cost very keenly indeed, and the need for courage will be very evident. Where do we find that courage? Well, where does Jesus find his courage? Well, I think it comes from the fact that Jesus knows that however unpopular his views might be on this issue, and as lonely as he might feel in taking this hard-line stance, Jesus isn't alone. He has God on his side, doesn't he? After all, it was God, Jesus tells us, who made them male and female in the first place. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. And so at the end of the day then, there are only two sides in this issue. There is the side of God, who creates and joins together, and there is a side of man who rips apart God's good design. And as hard as it might be, Jesus knows whose side he is better off taking. God's side. And it's in that fact then that he finds his courage. And so I end by saying it's in that source that we should find our courage today as we're questioned on these difficult issues, isn't it? Maybe this week you'll be in your common room at work and you'll be surrounded by your colleagues, and one of them will say something to you like, well, isn't it really good to finally see the Church of England blessing same-sex relationships? Or you're in a job interview and the interviewer says to you, I heard you're a Christian. You're not one of those pro-life Christians, are you? Or you're out with a group of friends and one of them says, isn't it really good that so-and-so got out of that marriage? And you consider your response. And on the one hand, you see the majority view. You see multitudes of men and women sort of calling you over to side with them. You don't want to make them unhappy. You don't want to make them cross. You don't want to be seen as a pariah. You want to do the reasonable, gentle, kind, acceptable thing. And it's so tempting then just to agree with that group. Well, I encourage you, look to the other side. And as lonely as it might seem, see on that side is none other than God himself. The true God, the living God, the good God, the God who determines what is best, who can be trusted and who will give you strength. And in that moment then say, I am going to side with him. So they're my 3 points. Yes, be aware of where the conversation is going. Proceed carefully. Yes, think big about how you're going to answer the questions with as little upset as possible. But before all of that, take courage. Let God be your guide. Let God be your companion. Join him. Echo his words, his truths. And in all of that, take courage. Amen.